Okay. Good on all of you for sticking around all day. I don't think I'm gonna talk at you for the full amount, especially since I'd love to have time for questions at the end. So, yeah, hopefully this will be interesting. It's gonna be a slightly different speed from the rest of the conference. I think a lot of what is focused on here is like things that you can do at home, and this is gonna be even like a global scale, looking at how food community systems done sustainably can feed and also heal the world. I like to start off this talk by reminding everyone that food is a place where every single issue intersects, right? So zooming out from your own backyard or your community, there are so many systems intertwining with food. And that's part of the reason why sustainable agriculture is a way that we can, as I said in like the title, like fuel the world, right? We have so many different communities affected by food in different ways. And it's a place where economy comes together. It's a place where your community comes together, your heritage, your lineage, your ancestors. It's a place where culture comes together. Another thing I really like to say off the bat is that I believe very strongly that there's no one right way to eat. There's no one sustainable diet. So I'm wary of folks who try to say things like that because even though on the one hand, in my own community, I have deep, deep respect for the vegan diet and that commitment. I'm not going to go to an indigenous community who's been stewarding their land for generations and say that they shouldn't eat animal, right? So we have to think about it that way. We have to remember that there's always a context. And in order to undo a lot of the things that our civilization, human systems have done, we have to recognize everybody's unique context and how nutrition and food access plays into that. Another thing I like to establish off the bat is some terminology, right? When you go to the grocery store, I'm sure you see things like this. Also, can I move around? I hope this doesn't. Okay. Oh, that's so much help. Okay.
Wait a second. One thing I'll say is the Zoom, the mic, if you can stay kind of close to the computer.
Okay. Around here, but at least now I can move around. Yeah. Okay. We see this kind of thing all the time, right? This is a form of marketing that we're very familiar with. You might look at this and think, oh yeah, like I know what that means, right? Like if I see that on a label, I know what it means. And I just want to point out that a lot of the food that we have today is greenwashed, right? We've heard of whitewashing, right? When the corporation does, maybe they donate to charity and it kind of covers up that they're the reason that charity is needed in the first place. Greenwashing is like that. So actually, none of this means anything. If you saw this stamp on something at the store, it doesn't mean jack. There are third-party certifications, like of course, USDA organic certification, the stamp, Rainforest Alliance certification, right? If you're using a rainforest crop like coffee or chocolate, these things can be very important, but they are an outside third-party certifier. And that's completely different from these words, which are unregulated. There's no regulation on these words at all. And the same thing goes for a lot of the things that we buy, like our eggs, for example, things like pasture raised, or we don't always have a good way to know whether we're actually getting what we're being created. So just keep that in mind with food because there's a lot of money wrapped up behind it, right? And speaking of money, I want to talk about the word eco, right? It is from the Greek for home. And one of the most important things I want walking away from all of this is going to be a very general overview of a lot of things, as opposed to like a really specific look at something specific. But the general overview to walk away with is that economy and ecology cannot be taken apart. We compartmentalize them in our culture, in our economy, right? We talk about them like they're separate, but everything that exists in the economy comes from the ecology, and the ecology comes first. So there's a reason that they have the same root of their word. And we used to talk a lot, like when I was at the Green Dining Alliance, the 3 Ps, people, planet, profit, was like a way to talk about, oh, how can we kind of adapt sustainability into the economy, right? We have to think about it economically. We have to consider the economy. And I just want to scrap that. I think that you have to see, okay, we start with ecology and what is a happy, healthy ecology, right? That's got to be the baseline for anything in the economy. I think maybe All right. Ooh, fun. More terms. We're not going to spend too long on this stuff, but I do want you to recognize that, again, with greenwashing, sometimes places will say that it's local when it's from 250 miles away. Prairie Farms does this. They say, oh, this is local dairy. It's actually a huge region of almost 300 square miles, right? Not to say that there's inherently something wrong with that, but again, when we think about food community systems, which is a huge part of what the focus has been here today, we're talking local and hyper local, which most of the commercial food systems that we live within do not operate under. Now I want to talk about, again, those intersections. I'm not going to just read slides to you because they're there, but basically, when we think about hunger, I think that that word means something to us. It's something that we can feel in our bodies. Food insecurity involves hunger, but it also could not, maybe you're not hungry, you just don't know where your next meal is going to come from, right? And there are a lot of people in our city and in our state that are dealing with this. I'd like to point out that the city and the rural communities, when it comes to food, there's actually a lot in common. We have way more in common than we have apart. And this is from the St. Louis website. So this is a demonstration of how those disparities, how the isms that I mentioned and all the intersections really come together. This is our equity score at 17 in red. We also have a disparity between Black and white children of 5.91, right? And that blue bar graph over there, that's Black households with children, and then white households beneath that. So proof that right here in our city, and I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here, like we're all at this conference, we've been learning a lot, and there are amazing people doing amazing things about this that are here. But again, it's like when we think about food justice, when we think about making food sustainable on a global scale, most people aren't really in touch with these things. Food justice, right? Oh,
Is it possible for me to ask you a question right now?
okay, sure.
So the slide that you just put up, the one right before this, where it talks about child food insecurity, whenever they put numbers up, why is the focus seeming like it's only on the city of St. Louis versus the county also, where I know there's food insecurity, a lot, a lot
Yeah.
of it. And it just seems mind-boggling that I don't know if it has to do with just the number of people in the city of St. Louis that makes that the focus versus our county areas.
Yeah.
But I don't know why we're not looking at the totality.
The region.
Yes.
The question is, when we see stats like this, why is it only about the city and not including the county where there is a lot of food insecurity happening and a lot of disparity? I'm not in government. I would guess that it's because we do have like two different tax groupings, right? Like the city has its own budget, and that budget probably determines the kind of resources that they can provide, right? Like the city's budget, which is has huge disparities in it. There's about 40% that goes to like one department and like 1% going to health and human services. My guess is why. I mean, you could probably look at county and city, combine them and look at the whole region. But yeah, I think this is from the city of St. Louis's website. So it's just the city. I hope that answers your question. Food justice. So I think one thing that we're trying to work toward when we look at community agriculture, sustainable agriculture, is a lofty goal like food justice, also food sovereignty. These two things are intertwined. They're not exactly the same thing, but I think you have to have food sovereignty in order to approach food justice. This kind of has to come first as a baseline, and it means that people get to decide what they grow and what they feed their families and what they eat themselves. And they're not dependent on outside sources that may or may not have their best interests in mind, right? We started off talking about the greenwashing. We'll get more into food systems a little bit too, but this is a prime example of like what people need all around the world, here, everywhere. And that's what forms a food community system. This is something, again, I'm going to talk generally about food systems in this, and it's all kind of big stuff that we as individuals can't tackle. But everything that was presented today at this conference, the resources here, all of us can do this right now, right? And this is already happening. There is a food community system in St. Louis, and it's only growing, right? So this is bringing all of those things together so that we can get closer to those loftier goals of justice and sovereignty. So I like to use this example when I start to talk about the big global food chains and what we're looking at there. This looks like a dystopian image, right? Like it could be from a movie or it could be on the cover of a novel. It has a very like futuristic dystopia feel. But this is actually a picture of some Syrian boys with bread outside of some camps back in 2009. This was in lead up to the Arab Spring. And for folks who were around or remember that time, were paying attention to what was happening, it was actually large in part spurred by a wheat shortage. All throughout the Middle East, people could not afford bread. And here's the thing about bread. If you take wheat and water and you cook it, you can eat indefinitely. I'm totally pulling that from Michael Pollan's show. I don't know if you've seen it, but they talk about this, how if you have access to wheat and you can cook it, you can eat. So half the world lives on bread, half the world lives on rice, right? We have these basic staples. And when people can't afford those things, they can't feed their families, and instability will happen, right? It happened to the Romanovs. It happened. We even have the term bread and circus from the Roman colonizers, right? It goes all the way back. So we need stable food systems, and we know that we have instability at our doorstep and also coming, right? Again, I'm not going to preach to the choir. We all know that climate change is a thing, but you might remember in the early years of COVID, we had that really, really intense shock of cold that went through Texas. They were completely unprepared. And a lot of what we heard about was that people were cold, right? It was a dangerous situation and it was an emergency. But the other thing is that farmers completely were left in the dust. Plants grow outside, they have specific needs, and when climate is completely unpredictable, we end up with really huge food crises because we've consolidated so much food in one place, right? You probably heard of how the Midwest used to be called the breadbasket of the country. Already the United States is a huge landmass. Like maybe we shouldn't be growing all of our bread in one basket. We should probably be growing it around. My mom always said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Like, now we have things like, oh, the country of Ukraine is responsible for a huge percentage of the world's wheat. The world, right? Not even just, oh, this is the basket of this region, or this is the basket of this country. We have global markets that are hinging on this. But all that aside, I think it's really, really important, and I would even say vital, to envision what we want. Like we see a lot of dystopia in media, right? It's common to have dystopia and war coming out of Hollywood. Everything's gray, everything's Hunger Games. Those are important messages to an extent, but especially people who are interested in food community, it's all about vision. You have to vision what we want, the kind of world we want to live in. This is an artist rendition of what San Francisco could be, right? And it's not anything shiny and glossy and expensive and fancy, right? It's actually old technologies. There's people riding bikes. We've got, windmills and some atriums on, it's not that crazy. And what I like to remind people is that we actually have everything that we need to do what we need to do. It's just a matter of putting our vision toward that and working toward that. So I'm going to show you a series of slides. Each one's going to get a little more real and a little more agriculture of like envisioning a better world. This is a campus on a Bangladesh school, and they've incorporated nature cooling technologies, water capture technologies, and all of that into campus. I don't think that this project is complete yet, but I just love the thought of strolling around between classes. And you could also make this into agriculture, right? You could grow some fish or some shrimp in there. You could do rice. You could do fresh cress for the dining hall. These are the kinds of things that the creative minds that are dedicated to good change need to be working on. This you might recognize this. This is actually Singapore. They've done an amazing job they've kind of rewilded their city. So this is their not private, their public park. And all of that greenery is alive at the bottom. They've actually done such a great job rewilding that they've cooled their temperatures multiple degrees, and they even have like wildlife returning to the city. You can now like see families of river otters like frolicking around in the park. And again, this would be a great opportunity for agriculture as well. Getting closer, this is a river that in our river Inar, shoot. It's a river in Munich that starts with I. It has trout you can fish, it has people swimming in it, but 20 years ago, this was not the case. This river goes right through town. There's several beautiful bridges over it, and it was not safe. It had been polluted. I think it was coal ash. There actually was a lot of coal in Germany. And over 20 years, they worked so hard at cleaning it up and protecting it that now there are trout swimming in it again, and you can fish them, and people are swimming on the banks any day that the weather is nice. There are people out there on the water, and you can't keep them away. I actually had the privilege to be there once, and I was looking down over the water, and I could see a bunch of those trout. They're gorgeous, just like swimming there. It was so beautiful to see them in the city. So this isn't widespread agriculture, right? Like this is just some people will go out, they'll have this go to do some trout fishing, and they'll catch some trout. But it gets even better. So I don't know if anyone here has heard of the Great Green Wall of the Sahara, but in the continent of Africa, I see some of it, starting in Senegal on the west coast and stretching all along the bottom of the Sahara or the Sahara, which is, certainly you've heard of it, it's a huge desert, stretches across many countries, and there's been a lot of concern about it growing. Sahara is getting bigger and bigger each year. So to stop the desert from creeping, a collective of nations said, what if we built a green wall to stop it? So they're raising the water table, they're halting desertification, and now too, these are all food villages. So they're using the natural and old techniques of capturing water in the soil, of enriching the soil, getting fruits down in the soil, and producing food in a combination of like new and old ways to make this wall and protect everybody who's living to the south of the Sahara. So I'm really, really jazzed about that project. Definitely look that one up. And this is closer to home. This is in Wyoming. So this is outside of Bright Agrotech's building. Bright Agrotech, obviously this is marketing for them, right? So they're not just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. But imagine though, if city streets had kale and collards in charge just growing, right? It would cool our cities, it would clean our air, it would look great, and people could pick it and on their way home. Why not? I mean, that's something that you'll see if you do travel abroad. It's a lot more common for like fruit trees to just kind of be growing, and people can just take some because there's an abundance of food. Whereas, at least growing up here in the St. Louis region, I was always kind of taught. I would ask people, well, why don't we have fruit trees? Like, why, we used to. It's like, why aren't they here? And people would always say, oh, well, they're a mess. They make a mess, which is, if you think about it, just so anti-life. But we can move back in this direction. Again, we have all the tools we need. We don't need something new and fancy to do it. And here's examples of things in the United States where, things are turning around. And again, sometimes it takes a long time. The Munich River took 20 years. 20 years of advocacy, Black farmers get debt relief. And then, we have things that take time, but 20 years at the end of the day isn't really that long to make a huge impact and turn things around. You can heal an entire ecosystem in 20 years. So there's a lot of great stuff happening. We just all need to hang on to that and work hard within it. Back to some less fun facts. So before we dive into sustainable indoor agriculture, we'll focus on plants, horticulture, right? If we're going to talk about sustainable agriculture, we have to bring up the impact of animal agriculture. I have the stats on how much more land and water and greenhouse gas emissions, say that 5 times fast, how much that is compared to a plant-based protein, right? And what we're seeing is that Chinese folks, as the middle class was rising up into the 90s and beyond, the diet also included more and more meat, partially because of our, McDonald's imperialism, right? McDonald's is everywhere. And this Western and American way of diet has been negatively impacting the entire world. So we see that as, just like what happened with Chinese folks, as they got more money and more access, meat consumption increased. We're seeing it in other places around the world too. The Nigerian middle class is a good example. So we know that people are going to be eating more meat. People need it and people deserve it. So we have to find a way to do it that's more sustainable going forward. And that's where I want to talk about indoor agriculture. So obviously, sustainable agriculture does not have to be indoors. However, this is what I have a little more expertise in, so I'm going to focus on it a bit more. Also, I think the rest of the conference has been more focused on soil and worms and the beautiful things that grow outside. So we're going to focus in on greenhouses, hydroponic systems. The differences between them are not really that huge. You could have a greenhouse that is also hydroponic, or you could have it with soil. I think looking at larger systems and sustainability, a greenhouse with soil is probably most of the time going to be the best option. You got the power of the sun, you don't need to buy lights, right? And with the soil, you have something that's alive and thriving. You don't have to add too much to it. Whereas hydroponic systems, it's just water, no soil. So you have to supplement that water with the nutrition of the soil somehow. And in most cases, that's through derived nutrients, which are not organic. They have to be created and shipped to you, right? So there's pluses and minuses to everything. I'll talk about that at the end. I don't want anybody to leave with like rose-colored lenses that, oh, there's one simple solution and it's hydroponics. No, we've got a complex problem ahead of us. Every context is different, as I was saying at the beginning, right? So we need a full toolbox, and indoor agriculture is a couple of the tools in that toolbox. And in terms of producing a lot of food for a lot of people, really fresh and really nutritious, it is one of the best ways to go. You can do it year round, right? Free from weather, soil, space constraints. So if you're in a city like St. Louis, where a lot of the soil is quite toxic, you don't have to worry about that. You can grow vertically, and in a, say, 8 by 40-foot space, you could grow up to 3 acres worth of land. So in cities where there are lots of people who need lots of food and nutrition, this is one of the best ways to do it. You can also do it at home. So again, we're all empowered to be a part of that food community system for ourselves and for our neighbors. Here's kind of like, I guess, the wide range, right? So you've got this beautiful, this atrium, I guess, atria of Austria that could grow a lot of food for a lot of people. I don't think that that's what's happening, but it's one example of indoor horticulture. Or you can have something really simple, something very inexpensive, something that almost anyone can do, and may not even require many power tools at all, other than maybe a drill. And you can grow enough food for a small family, at least enough produce in there for a small family. And with some climate measures, you could do it even in multi-seasons, 3 to 4 seasons a year. I'm gonna pivot to the Dutch. So this is an example of how these larger food systems, when a government decides to set an aggressive goal for sustainable agriculture, a lot can get done. This is another 20-year period. The Dutch decided that they wanted to have more food sovereignty. They wanted to be able to grow all of their own food and also export, because at that point they were importing pretty much everything other than cheese. So they said, okay, how can we do it? And how can we do it in a way where we're going to use fewer pesticides or even eliminate them altogether? We're going to use fewer antibiotics and things for our animals. We're going to give the animals a better life. Indoor agriculture was the way. They used the power of the sun whenever they could. These are greenhouses, right? So they don't need supplemental lighting for that. They even used indoor vertical stacking agriculture for animal agriculture. So these are little chicks. You can kind of see them. It's a little bit blurry, but they're all running around. They're not overcrowded. They can move. So even though this does look very industrial, and it's certainly not like what I like to think of. I like to think of chickens running around and eating bugs and playing in the dirt. However, people eat chicken, and this is a place where they've been able to cut over 90% of their antibiotic use because the animals just aren't sick. They're happy, they're healthy, they're running around. So they did this for pork and beef as well. They cut back on their land use, their water use, and their antibiotic use by like 70 and 80%, depending on the animal. So they made some huge strides. But fancy recent high-tech stuff aside, I have to take a moment to offer huge gratitude to Asia when it comes to indoor agriculture and growing lots of food in small amounts of spaces. A lot of people don't know that American agriculture, the intense output that comes from the West Coast and the Central Valley and up in Washington State, a lot of that comes from Japanese farmers. They were forcibly removed from their farms, and then those farms were taken, and then all of that bounty of that knowledge from living in islands where there wasn't a lot of arable land, there wasn't a lot of space, all those techniques for growing a lot of food in small spaces became the agricultural boon of California and Washington State that we have today. So this is a mushroom farm. I also just love mushrooms. This is pretty low tech. You know, you can see they've got climate control, they've got misting so that it stays nice and humid, but it's just glass jars full of mycelium on these crates, and they're producing a ton of food in a small amount of space. So this is one prime example. If you want to look at really awesome indoor agriculture, East Asia and Southeast Asia are leading the way. This is another reason why I like to talk about indoor agriculture. We have, in a very small amount of time, in terms of the Earth's history, we've claimed over 50% of the land to grow our food. So when we think about, again, your backyard garden, your community gardens, your urban farms, there is absolutely space for that. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about going through Iowa and Illinois and Missouri and seeing, you know, miles and miles and miles and miles of nothing but corn. And we see that all around the world, right? That's pretty new. But we can decolonize a lot of what we have colonized by growing indoors in cities, in suburbs. We can grow a ton of fresh, nutritious food for the people who live there in those densely packed spaces. And then we can let the wild rewild a little bit, right? That's part of what's behind this. Obviously, not every crop can grow indoors, not every crop can grow vertically. Again, there is no one silver bullet. But I think that allowing the restoration of habitat and biodiversity is one of the biggest things we can do for the planet and for ourselves. But no rose-colored lenses. So indoor agriculture is not for everyone. It's not for every situation, and it's not for every solution. It takes a lot of upfront capital to build these things. A lot of them are made with newly fabricated plastics. And if you go to YouTube and you look up, hey, like, how do I make a DIY hydroponic system at home? 95% of them are going to say, go get some PVC and drill holes in it. PVC is cheap, it's modular, you can do whatever you want with it, but it is an extremely toxic plastic. So, and it's not recyclable, it comes from very bad factories. There's just a lot to consider when you're trying to synthesize what nature does on its own indoors, right? How can you do it in a way that isn't contributing more to the problem along the way? Again, a lot of things have to be shipped. I mentioned nutrients. There are organic ways to do hydroponics, and I think aquaponics, which I didn't speak about much yet, but that's where you have plants growing, and then below that, in the water, you have some kind of fish or shellfish. They produce the nutrients through their poop, right? That feeds the plants. You don't have to bring in a bunch of supplements for your water. So there are more sustainable ways to do it, but these drawbacks are present in a lot of systems. And there are a lot of indoor agriculture places that will say that they're chemical free. Oh yeah, we don't use chemicals, which doesn't really make sense. I mean, everything's a chemical, right? But also they are using derived nutrients, because if you use the organic nutrients in most systems, it clogs up the pipes, it creates a lot of slime. So there's just kind of this dance you have to do. Producing a lot for little, there's always a price. I will say though, and I've mentioned like fresh, nutritious food a number of times. One of the things I would think it makes sense to think about when you're like thinking in the city, what do we grow and where do we grow it and how do we grow it? Things like leafy greens and strawberries, tomatoes, herbs, things that have like after you pick them, they're going to wilt really quickly, right? They don't have a good shelf life. They're very fragile. Things that are mostly water, stuff like that, it really makes sense to grow in a hydroponic or an aeroponic system because if you do it and you eat it within a couple days, you're getting all that nutrition. Whereas if you're buying it at the store or from a restaurant, but it's been shipped from far away, especially things like leafy greens, they lose their nutrition by percents every single day after they've been picked. So even if you're eating something that looks good and is crisp, if it was picked a week ago or 2 weeks ago, you're not getting the full benefit of that nutrition. You can get that from a hyper local farm that is offering indoor ag. And this is kind of tying it back in. I want to stress again that like the fancy solution is not necessarily the solution. So we don't need big tech to solve our problems. Actually, all of these technologies and systems of wisdom and information, it exists within most of the agronomadic societies around the world, right? Humans were agronomadic at some point. This is something that all of us have in common. And all across the world, indigenous communities have held on to really important stewardship knowledge. They are consistently being restricted, right? But they still have them and they're still keeping them and pulling them forward. I like to, and I've been including this tweet for many years. For those who can't read it, it's this is from like 2021 maybe. I'm donating $100 million toward a prize for the best carbon capture technology. That's Elon Musk. And then someone just says, congratulations to whoever invents forests, right? Because it's this misconception that we have. We can't keep trying to engineer our way out of a problem that comes from over-engineering. Like we just need forests and biodiversity. We need these wisdoms that have always existed. So you can take things like terraced rice paddies, which provide a ton of life for biodiversity beyond just the rice that it's growing. You can restore a wetland and have a fishery out of it and invite all of that. The birds that haven't been there for generations, they will return, right? These things have been done. They're not, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This is something I'm going to recommend watching. We're not going to watch it right now, but this is a TED Talk by Alan Savory. And this guy really has a redemption arc. If you know who he is, he's a scientist who from South Africa, I believe, and he was on the forefront of putting out information, scientific studies proving that the tribal folks who were taking their grazing animals were causing desertification and deforestation, right? And this for a long time, I remember learning this when I was growing up in the 90s. Oh yeah, well, it's sad, but it's true, you know, those shepherds, they really can't take their stuff. They're going to overgraze and then everything dies. And then we have spreading of the desert and it's a problem. So he was at the forefront of this research. And over 20 years or so, he started to see that he was really horrifically wrong. Everything was getting worse. They had penned away the animals and the people who had stewarded that land for generations. And they were finding that the desertification was increasing, the water table was dropping, the megafauna that they were trying to protect were dying at faster numbers. And so actually they said, well, hey, what if we were wrong? And they started investigating and they found that they were. And now they have proof of their own mistakes and are trying to rectify that wrong by going around the world and starting reforestation and restoration projects that include the traditional shepherding practices, because we now know, a lot of us know, that misconception of grazing animals, it's actually the opposite. Grazing animals are the reason that grasslands are alive. When they walk through, they leave their droppings. They also churn up the earth with their heavy steps. All these natural things happen, and that actually restores everything. They also spread seeds. I mean, there's everything about it because it's a natural system. So this is again, it's a TED Talk. Alan Savory. I recommend watching it. It's quite moving, and I just like to see someone who admits that they're wrong and tries to make it right. Nope. Also on the topic of I think this is a really good example of the intersection of everything that we've talked about with colonization, with food system, with aquaponics. This is an image of Tenochtitlan, or as we know it now, Mexico City. So somebody, Thomas Cole, Kole, definitely look up Portrait of Tenochtitlan by Thomas Cole. He took all of the archaeological information that we have and mapped out a blueprint of what the city looked like before the Spanish came. So what was Mexico City before colonization? And there are a lot of really great records that we have, and you can also see some of its footprint in Mexico City today. So there's this beautiful online project. You can look at all of these images of what it was like to be in this city. And this is what it was. Mexico City was a lake. It was a lake and a crater in the center of all of these amazing mountains, and it was full of floating farms. So they ate their food from chinampas. These were all set out in networks throughout. You can imagine the wildlife in the city, right? I mean, it would have been water and forest and farm everywhere. Just absolutely incredible. If I could time travel, I would want to go here. And the Mexica were feeding themselves through this method. They were also having infrastructural waste collection and composting. So at the end of the day, someone would combine the gondola, they take your waste, they go compost it. So everything was clean, recycled, and healthy, and everybody was well fed. This is an example of what this metropolis looked like, and they were feeding themselves, right? So again, cycling back to what I'm saying is that yes, we have new technology, more information, more studies. I'm not saying that we should only look to the past, but for all those, tech bros who try to say that they've invented the perfect new farm or the perfect new thing, they haven't invented anything. It's always been here. And people have been figuring out ways to feed themselves in sustainable, healthy ways for a long time. If you go to Mexico City today, I think there is one surviving farm outside the city. You can go there, you can ride through the canal, and I think you can even have a meal of some of the traditional foods that are grown on that land. So if you're in Mexico City, I know that would be my first stop. So just to tie it in at the end here, I want to talk about some things that are happening closer to home. One place that I recommend looking up is Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi. I think a lot of the folks who are at booths here today, it's like they did this in Cooperation Jackson at a really large scale. And they took that concept of how you cannot separate ecology and economy, and you cannot separate food sovereignty and food justice, right? They looked at land use, they looked at community development, and they looked at economic policy, and they grew a ton of food. Really, really cool stuff to look into there. Oh my. Okay, I don't know what that was. Appalachia. This is especially important now after Helene. There are still a lot of mutual aid networks that are trying to get food to people. I think we think of Appalachia in the South and we think of farming communities, and that tends to be in cities how we think of rural communities in general. But food insecurity has always been present in Appalachia. It has always been a problem, and it's even more of a problem now. And a lot of that comes from the fact that aside from the coal industry and how that affected the region, on top of that, there isn't a lot of arable land. There isn't a lot of farmland in these rocky hills, right? So folks, even with a lot of self-sufficiency, have always been using mutual aid to help each other out. And this is an example of mutual aid network that became like an actual organization with a certification. But people do it just as neighbors, and they can do it as a 501c3 as well. I also have the Anishinaabe Food Sovereignty Project. So this encaptures it all, right? Like they've got health, economic development, culture, and nationhood. And all of these things are the holistic picture of what food justice looks like, food sovereignty looks like. If you want to learn about food sovereignty, go to the indigenous folks. They're the ones who have been holding it down and going along that forefront. And they're doing amazing things all across our country and all across the world, right? So it's in acknowledging what they already know that we'll find solutions that we need. And at the very end of this presentation, also tying it back to St. Louis, this is actually from an interview that just happened within the past month. Hero and Food City are two great resources to look into. Food City has kind of a connected network. There might even be someone here from Food City. I don't know, but what's happening in St. Louis is really exciting, and there's so much really, really amazing work being done. So that Hero is outdoors, but I think that we have a lot of potential in the future to see indoor and outdoor working together to solve a wider map of problems and create even more food for a denser population here in the city and county. And that's a wrap.